Oh yeah, you can. You can. I've turned it off for everybody else. So
with great power.
Yes, comes a punch. I own the code of conduct, so I can break it. So I can chuck myself out. You need to erase that now somehow.
Yeah, I did it.
Oh, good. Yeah, except pretty much. Yeah, exactly. Right. So you should all be able to see my screen at least. There's going to be lots of flicking between different things tonight because I'm presenting on my laptop and we'll have to switch to Jon's at some point. So yeah, it's all good. So thanks very much for coming along to .NET Knots. I am going to turn my video on so you can at least see me speaking. There's me. I'm in stereo because you can see me on Jon's laptop as well. Hopefully you can't hear me. Exactly, I too. It's worse than 1 peat, 2 peats. So yeah, thanks very much for coming along. If I can get my clicker to work. There we go. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a code of conduct in place. There's a fair amount of words on the screen here, but it really just boils down to that bottom right-hand one. Be kind and considerate to others, and everything will be all good. You can see a bigger version of that there at that bit.ly. If anybody does feel like they're uncomfortable for any reason, then come to myself if you're in person, or come and interrupt Jon if you feel like you need to do that. It's perfectly fine. Connell also helping out, and our chaperone tonight over there is Chris Emerson. I'm sure that maybe you don't like the decor or something. It's lovely. Don't know why you wouldn't. But either way, just be nice. It'll all be good. We'd like to thank our sponsors for tonight. Primarily, we'll start with BGSS because otherwise we'll be very wet and cold because it's rubbish out there. So thank you to the folks that have come in person braving the weather. But they've supplied where we are tonight. So thanks to them for hosting that. Cordius, they are a really good local recruiter, tech recruiter based in Nottingham. Do go check them out if you've got any recruitment requirements whatsoever. Really good ethical recruitment, really nice folks. They're sponsoring the drinks you're drinking and the food that I'll order in the not too distant future, which by the way will be around 7:45 if I've not already told you that. My company, I get to put that on there because I'm doing the hosting and why not? And JetBrains and Calix, if you tweet on the hashtag .NETKnots, then one lucky person will win a JetBrains license. If you've not heard of JetBrains, firstly, I don't know where you've been, but if you haven't, then they make developer tools for developers, things like Rider and IntelliJ, WebStorm, PHP Storm, things like that. Something called ReSharper, I don't know. But yeah, you can win one of their single products for 12 months if you just tweet on that hashtag .NETKnots. Photos preferred, but not required. And likewise, Calix, so they're a local medical AI company, and they're supplying us with a book for tonight, which Jon will likely choose a Blazor book. Could be anything, I suppose. Could be Patrick Stewart's autobiography. That would be quite cool. And again, same thing, hashtag .NETKnots. And at some point after this meetup, we'll draw that and let you know. UK only for those folks online. The JetBrains is everywhere, but the book, sadly, because of postage costs, is just UK only. So bear that one in mind. I'm an MVP along with, in fact, I think I might be the only MVP here tonight, which is a crying shame because I know several people here that really ought to be MVPs. If you don't know what that is, then it's a reward from Microsoft for doing things like hosting events like I'm doing here, or doing like Jon does, speaking at events, or contributing to open source, or being a part of a different community. Then you get rewarded with that particular certification, that award, and that gives you access to that Microsoft underlying subsystem. So you get direct access to the product groups, as they're called, to be able to interact with them and drive the direction of their products, as well as free Azure credits and Office and Windows. And there's a definite benefit, but being able to get that contact with Microsoft is super important. So tonight we've got our speaker Jon Hilton from Hero to Zero of Blazor and .NET 8, which is awesome. So looking forward to that. Obviously .NET 8 is not coming out for another 3 weeks, something like that. 2 weeks, yeah. We're at RC2.
RC2,
yeah. So it's proper up-to-date talk. So I'm looking forward to hearing from that. I am actually speaking at the end of this month if I can get my act together and finish writing the talk. I've started it, but we'll be talking about how we can use Azure Cognitive Search along with OpenAI to be able to use your own data with OpenAI and not just using the connection that you can use from OpenAI, actually building the two services together. So that should be quite an interesting talk. So that'll be back here at BGSS if they'll have us back. So same thing as tonight. And then, all being well, in a couple of weeks' time, we'll have Peter Shaw and Jose Samoes talking about .NET Nano Framework and hacking Lego Mindstorms, which should be an interesting talk. That one will be online. So that'll be worth checking out if IoT or even just using .NET in a different way is something that you'd find interesting. And with that, you can stop listening to me babbling on now for the night. And we'll do, yes, that's right. So I'm going to stop sharing. And then we are going to switch over connections. So bear with us just one sec. I'm going to mute myself and pass you over to Jon. So thank you very much. While Jon's setting up, if we ask everybody just to keep muted while Jon's giving his talk, and just put your questions in the chat. Connell and I will be modding the chat here. So if there's any burning questions, we will interrupt Jon on your behalf. And if it's really complicated and we can't relay it, we'll ask you to come off mute and ask Jon directly. That will mean that everybody in the room will be able to hear. So a far better way of doing it. We will read out the questions anyway. For folks in the room or people in the room asking questions, we'll do the same so everybody can do that. So yeah, enjoy, folks, and we'll catch you on the other side.
Okay. I jumped the gun.
You did.
They can hear me though. That's good.
Yes.
So thank you for braving the rain if you did, and if you haven't, I do not blame you if you're at home watching this. We drove through floods leaving Shrewsbury, rural Shropshire, and then we drove through more floods arriving in Nottingham in the city centre. So it's obviously bad when the city centre is flooding. So as Pete kindly introduced me there, I won't relabel those points. But today we're just going to look at .NET 8. But we're going to start in an interesting place, perhaps, which is a simple question. If I was asking you, and this may seem like an odd question, but I asked you to build a shed, and I said, right, I want you to build a shed, and it's going to be amazing. It's going to be by a lake for some reason, and it's going to have a little boat by it for another unknown reason, and it's going to glisten like the sun's going to shine off it at sunset, and it's going to be absolutely amazing. And you start thinking, well, this is a bit weird that you've asked me to build a shed, but you know, I guess I'll give it a go. I've never really built a shed, but I'll have a go. And I say, oh yeah, and I went to the hardware store, and I don't really know what you need, but I found all these amazing bargains. So I bought like this massive petrol-powered saw, and then a load of self-tapping screws, apparently, hundreds of those. I don't know what they do. I'm sure you'll, you know, find a use for them. And this thermal roof adhesive. Again, just, you know, go away and build what you can. And you're probably thinking, well, I don't know, it's a bit odd, like a hammer, a few nails might have been useful, maybe, you know, I'm not sure these are the tools I need, but I'll give it a go. But there's a good chance that if you try to build, and my shed building skills are very limited and my knowledge runs out about there. So, but chances are if you try to build a shed with some of these tools, and this is all you had, it probably wouldn't end brilliantly. And it probably certainly wouldn't represent or be the shed that you had in your dreams when you started this shed building project. And I think that's enough about sheds. I've stretched that metaphor as far as I can possibly, as far as it will go. But the point really is, those tools are fine, the tools that I forced you to use to build the shed. But are they the best tools? I mean, they're perfectly good tools for a job, but they may not be the best tools for that job. And I think that's the key. So what I think we're looking at with .NET 8 and Blazor is that Microsoft are essentially giving us more tools. So we'll get into, in a second, the different render modes that are available and how you can build a project from scratch. But this is kind of how I see it. They're giving us a few other ways of building Blazor apps. And it comes down to what's the best one for the job that we're trying to do. And that varies because you can build a landing page, you could build a line of business app with, you know, millions of rows of data, you could build a fairly disconnected app that runs on mobile. So there's all kinds of different things you can build with Blazor. And clearly, the different hosting models and various things, you know, suit different requirements. So the first one I wanted to look at is static server-side rendering, which is kind of new in Blazor. It actually kind of existed before, but it's a thing they're making a big deal about this time. Then there's the single streaming rendering, which builds on that. And these are all, you can think of these as layers. They kind of build on top of each other. Interactive server, interactive WebAssembly. So we'll look at all of these in turn, I think. And it's kind of interesting when you talk about static server-side rendering. So hands up in the room if you know what this is. Pete does, because he's on the end. Now we know what this is. Yeah.
Of the front-end frameworks.
Interestingly, kind of, yes. It's an old one. So this is the first web page that was published, like made publicly available, basically, in 1991. I think actually they lost the 1991 version, so this might be the 1992 version, but we'll just, we'll go with it. And in a way, and it's interesting you say that, because the fundamentals of the web are all here, right at the beginning. So you've got, headings, you've got text, you've got hyperlinks. You can click on a hyperlink to find out more information. And if you think about what this is just, as I say, static, server-side rendering. So it's essentially hitting a server, loading a HTML file or some kind of resource and returning that to the browser and displaying it. And this is, kind of where we started, essentially. And in a way, what .NET 8 brings us with static server-side rendering is a kind of evolved version of this. So we can make a request to a web server, we can somehow generate HTML, we can return that back to the web browser and the browser can display it. And that's it. Quite a simple kind of mechanism that's as old as the web, literally. So today's plan is to use .NET 8 and build from scratch a Marvel character search, essentially. Just something a bit like this, that we can search for a character and show the results. And let's do it, I think. So if we just jump straight into this and see how far we get in the code. Okay, so this is if you've done any work with Blazor, you have seen some variation of this app. And a bit like me here, probably prototypes and things that have stuck with this UI for quite a lot longer than it should be allowed to live, with these counters and all the rest of it. And this is what you get now if in Blazor you do .NET News. So there's a new template called Blazor. And you can also do this through Visual Studio. But it's worth a quick look. There's a lot of options here, but one or two I just wanted to kind of call out is that you've got this interactivity. So we're going to look at these. These are the new render modes. And this allows you to choose whether you enable them. So you start with this static thing that we're going to look at, and then you can enable Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly if you want to, and then Auto, which is this clever thing that kind of switches between them. But you don't have to. You can choose not to use any of those modes. And the other one, just to call out, which landed in RC2. So you could say they were cutting it a little bit fine, but they did actually add this in, this auth option in release candidate 2. And we'll talk about that very briefly. We'll just look at what that is. So that allows you to create a project which has built-in auth. And they're kind of the main options. And when you do that, you end up with this. Now, the reason there's so much code here, because this looks quite verbose, there's got a lot in here, is because I went with the enable interactivity with server and WebAssembly and auth. So I've basically done everything and the kitchen sink in this project. So it's more verbose than what you might end up with. If you didn't enable those options, or you didn't, especially auth, if you cut auth out of this, you end up with a much smaller project. But it's interesting to kind of see what this is. So just out of interest, in the room, I guess I can do this. Just hands up if you've used Blazor at all for any kind of project. Okay, that's interesting. And hands up if you use it a lot, like for most of your work, or, okay, cool. Hands up if you've never used it at all for anything. Okay, so it's kind of, that's about the split I usually see, interestingly. There's people who are new to it, there's people who've used it. In general, I think people who use it quite often go on to use it a lot if they can. So I think that tells you that people find it quite productive, but it's kind of interesting to know. So what we get with .NET 8 is there is no remnant of Razor pages or MVC in here, which is a big change. So in the previous new template, you would get a tiny bit of Razor pages. It's basically like the start page was a Razor page. And now it's all Blazor all the way down. So what you've got now is this is the starting point for the app, and it's this app.razor. And it is a Razor component. So Microsoft, naming is hard. So although we're talking about Blazor, they are Razor components. Take it up with them. And this is it. This is essentially the template. And as you can see, it's actually really quite nice and lean, which is good. This is now separate roots component and a head outlet, but most of this is just, bringing in a few style sheets, and that's kind of it. And then in terms of identity, there's an interesting thing with auth, which is that it's hard. Doing auth at all is hard. Building your own is probably a bad idea at this point. I think there's so many threat vectors and things that you would struggle to mitigate trying to build your own auth. There's an option here to use things like Auth0 and platforms like that, which are also really good options. But I think Microsoft, with this release, have kind of recognized that sometimes for a first-party app, you do just want the option to have auth out of the box, basically. And then you have this interesting thing, which is, do you try and hide it? So if Microsoft give us auth, do they hide it away so it just works and we use it? Or do they expose all of it so that we can tweak it and change it? And of course, that's an imperfect choice, because sometimes we don't want to get into the details and sometimes we do. And I think what they've done here is essentially give you as much auth as you could possibly want. You could not have more auth in this project template. So these are all Razor components. And like I say, I think that's kind of the choice, really. You either have this, which allows you to essentially change how auth works completely, or they hide it away. And in this case, they've exposed it. And I think for the general of a GA release, they're going to stick with this. But what it means is that you get this auth UI, if you choose to include it, including the ability to log in, which I've already done, I believe, and register and all that kind of thing. Again, because I've already logged in, it's just taken there. But all that UI exists, and it's all Razor components. So I think, if this is what you need, first party auth, this is probably a good launching off point for you to then extend it and do what you want to do with it. But I just wanted to show you that, so you've kind of seen that it does exist, it does work in .NET 8, and it's all Razor components. And that also explains a lot of the complexity of the program.cs. So actually, the vast majority of this is here because I enabled auth. So if I didn't enable auth, a lot of this would disappear, but all of this is here because of auth. And the same thing I just said, you either hide this away or you make it available. If you've ever tried to build it yourself or integrate ASP.NET Identity yourself, you probably recognize this code. This is what you'd have to do. So you can just enable it out of the box. That's it. It's probably as much as I really want to talk about auth. I shy away from talking about auth too much because I don't want to be an auth expert, because I think that carries some expectation that you know what you're doing and that you're not going to, break everyone's websites in a very important way. So it's good to know it exists and it works out of the box. So this is our homepage. And what I was just going to do is kind of show you the static server-side rendering first. So by default, that's what's going to happen here. So this component, which is one of the ones you get in the project, is going to run statically. What does that mean? It means that when you look at this in the browser, what actually happened here is kind of hidden from us. So let me just rerun this page. Is you notice this is a document here. I think it's because I'm not running. Let me just get this running again. So watch. So .NET Watch is handy if you're working in Blazor, because it allows you to run the program in a way that it supposedly hot reloads as you're working on it. I think there's been some issues with hot reload. People have found it sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. I feel like it's better in .NET 8. That's my experience. It would be nice because it's really useful when it works. It allows you to do things like change this. This is where it can go horribly wrong. This doesn't work. There you go. And then updates in real time. So that kind of dev loop is quite important, I think, when we're working on things. But with that running, and if I go back here and look at the dev tools again, this is a full document request. So that's really the key here, is that we've made a request, it's gone to this Blazor component, it's rendered it, and what it's returned is static HTML. So there is no long running, component here. This is just static HTML returned. And that's what we're dealing with. And that's kind of the gist of the new render mode, which you, I think, will probably find yourself using in .NET 8 by default, because it's kind of the one that comes out of the box, and then you can layer it up from there. So that's a kind of, almost back to the 1992 web page approach. You hit the server, you get a page, HTML back, and you render it in the browser. But what I wanted to do is try and build this Marvel search engine. And out of the box with the new Blazor template, as it's always been, you have Bootstrap. Now, so we're saying that for my projects, I tend to use Tailwind CSS. Tailwind CSS is a really divisive thing to throw out because people either really love it or kind of don't trust it or possibly hate it. Some of the hate's too strong. But Tailwind is about utility classes. So you can go into some markup and you can add a utility class, to give it a margin, for example. And actually, Bootstrap does a similar thing these days. So they've got a lot more of these than they used to have. And that just gives you a margin at the bottom of a value. So I would use Tailwind, but I think in this case, it's good to kind of see what we can do just by using what we get, built in with Bootstrap. So what I'd probably do here is just create a new folder. And I'm just going to speed this up and not spend ages typing code for you, just check out this. So what I tend to do is start with a folder structure like this. So if I'm building a new feature, I would tend to create a folder for it. And then this, you can call this anything you like, but I tend to have index.razor as the home page and then other pages within here. So it'd be so if you go /search, which is what this should be, then you're going to end up here in the folder structure. And then as I extend this feature, maybe breaking out more components and that kind of thing, I would tend to put them in this folder. And I just find that's useful because if you come to work on a feature, my acid test is how easily can I find the code, and that's kind of the thing that I now tend to do. So this is the search page. So what that should mean, if I just save that and go to /search, with a bit of luck, might need to just case matters here. That's the kind of thing that might catch you out. You also have to watch the hot reload because occasionally it says it needs to do a full reload for that to actually work. So just do that as well. What's going on? Oh, there's a hidden character at the end. There you go. So that's the search page. And what we can do now is just kind of rapidly iterate the UI. So when I'm building a new feature, I tend to think, how quickly can I get something on the screen? And I tend to do that with HTML. So I'm quite visual as well. And I find it useful to get some markup on the screen and something in the browser. And I'll quite often work down from that. So then bring in data, bind it to data later, but almost, start with the UI. And what we could do here in this case is use the Bootstrap framework. And there's a thing in Bootstrap, which is kind of handy, which is this thing called a card. And if the thing that we're building is pretty much this, I would say. So I would, to get something up and running quickly, be quite tempted to use something like this. And what I might do is just, make this a bit bigger. Somewhere in here, there's like a card grid. So there's about as much here as you could possibly want in terms of the options. But down here, they've got this grid. And for what we're building, that's almost exactly what we need. So it'd be quite handy here just to bring this in. So I'd be tempted to bring in this markup like so. And then pop that in here. And I think I'm going to be missing a div unless it's put it in for me. Yeah. Okay. And if we go back to that page. Okay. So we're done. There you go. Marvel search engine. Let's call it a night. Have a few more beers. No, it's kind of it's kind of getting there, but obviously there's a bit of work to make that look nice. But there is a benefit to just getting something working on the screen, and obviously we can paste an image here and do a bit of work with it. But this is kind of like how, as I say, how I would tend to do this. And you can even test what this looks like if you throw more than one in. I mean, it's going to be a lot of HTML to start with, but then you can test how it looks responsively. So I find this is, just a productive way to get started. If we evolve this slightly, though, we can bring in images. And I'm just going to, again, save typing this all out in front of you. Force that. Okay, so we can just extend this slightly. and bring in images. And what I've done here is bring in the Marvel API. So the Marvel API is quite old, and all the C# wrappers for it are quite old, including one I found that didn't run async and all sorts of things. But, you know, it's not what we're really here to discuss in detail, but there is a Marvel API that's kind of okay, called Marvel Sharp, I think it is. And all I've done here is bring that in. So imported the NuGet package and plumbed it in program.cs. So I'll show you what that looks like. This is a handy tip, by the way. If your program.cs is getting too big, then and you want to add more to it, like I did here, a really good pattern I found is to use this extension methods approach. So you can just kind of create an extension method for the thing that you're adding, put all of the code, which gives you the builder here. And obviously you can then do as much config as you like in here, and then it becomes a one line of code in your program.cs. So it's just a handy pattern that I tend to adopt. But all this is doing is pulling in and configuring the Marvel API, really. So that's how we arrived at this situation where we've got this available to us. And what we can do is inject it. So right at the top, we can inject the Marvel API like that. For the people on Zoom, that's now a perfect size to read, but because this is such a big screen, you're like, oh, my eyes. So sorry about that, hybrid's hard. And then down at the bottom here, this is just the onInitialize method. So when you essentially render this component for the first time, it's going to run this code, and it's going to try and get some characters, in this case, with a hard-coded value, name starts with, and it's going to set a field here with the results. And then we can loop over those results with a bit of a null check here and render that card markup. So this is pretty much the markup we had before. The inline style police in the audience are going to have a real go at me about this. So avert your eyes. It was a ... a minute ago. That's all you need to know. So if we just rerun that, what we should have though, so obviously that's just a hard-coded search for Captain America, well, Captain actually, but there you go. So it's kind of a good example. That card markup is very much what we copy and pasted from Bootstrap. So I'm all for rapidly getting something on the screen. I think that's the key when we're building features. And, you know, bind it to a bit of data, and suddenly we've got a, you know, almost got a Marvel search here within a few minutes, really. And we'll look at it, how to actually make this search now, I think, because that's useful. Then I'll explain a bit about what's going on under the covers. So obviously at the moment, this is hard-coded, but what we probably want to do is make this searchable. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, oh, search, interactivity, you need to go full Blazor server or WebAssembly. But there's a mechanism that existed for, you know, for years that still exists, which is just forms. So the web has kind of been built on forms. And before JavaScript and ASP, even all these things came along, the way that people interacted with web pages was through forms, basically. And in a way, we can go back to that and say, well, if that's the simplest thing, then, you know, maybe we should just use a form, because it allows us to do things like search in a really simple way. So we can put a form in. We can, what that will do by default is do a GET request back to the same page, and then you can put an input in, you know, give it a name. Again, I'll just speed this up by switching to this one. Okay, and what you end up with is this. Now, interestingly, because this is Blazor, although the form here is a standard HTML form, and I've just done a tiny bit of, you know, Bootstrap styles here, and I'll tell you what, I'll just go to that for a minute so you can see what's going on. I'll come back to that one. But this here is a Razor component that we can use, which is the input text. And it's just a convenient thing, really. So instead of putting input and then the name equals search term and making sure that matches up with something that we need somewhere else, we can bind it here using this input text component. And then we're binding it to this property called search term. And it just saves like magic strings and typing the wrong thing and it falling apart because we renamed something later. And if we scroll down here, the key is we can then say, well, what we want to happen is when that form's submitted and it does the get request to this page, we want the value for search term to be kind of populated here from the query string. So I'll show you what it looks like and then how that, you'll see how that can work. So if I type spider here, hopefully that reloaded. Okay, there you go, that works. And up here we can see, it's very small, but you can see that bit bigger, question mark search term equals spider. So that's kind of how forms work. If you do nothing else with a vanilla form in HTML, you know, that's the behavior you'll get. It will essentially do a get to the same page, and it will pass, in this case, our input, which is this name search term. And you'll see that in the post, in the get, sorry. So if we look at the network here, and just do that again, and you can see here the payload. So we can see really, you know, it's really simple stuff. It's like web, almost a Web 101, I guess, this mechanism. So we're not doing anything really that clever with it. The only thing we're then doing is saying, that's great. What we want is .NET to be able to kind of take that incoming value and bring it into here and populate search term. And of course, when it's done that, we're then able, in the onInitialize method, to use that search term to do our search. So that's it. That's our static server-side rendering. So it's worth just kind of saying, well, what's actually happening when we do that under the hood, under the covers? And this is it. So we've got our browser, which is requesting the page. It makes a request to the .NET server. And in .NET 8, what that will do, by default, more or less, is it will hit a router on the server, and the router will look for a Razor component. It will forward that request to the Razor component, render the Razor component. In this case, it's home.razor, or it could be our search.razor, and then it will send the whole page back. So that's kind of it, a very clean flow. There's no long running components. We don't need to worry about app state or component state really, because it's like a one and done thing that gets that back. But there's just an interesting thing here that you may have noticed if I go back to the code, which is that I put a bit of code here to say, well, look, in the event that the character search result is no, show this loading indicator. But what's interesting, you may not have noticed it because it never shows. So the question is, well, what's going on here? Why, if I go to search and type in a name and then try and search, you didn't see the loading indicator. So you kind of had to wait for the whole page to come back and then you saw everything. And that's a bit of a problem. So if you think you've got a slightly long running request here to the Marvel API, you probably don't want the user to just sit there with a, you know, the browser spinning around, because they'll probably think it's broken, especially if it takes a long time. But it kind of means at the moment that this didn't work. So my attempt here to kind of handle that just isn't doing anything. So the solution to that is something called stream rendering, which we can bring in with an attribute and do like this, stream rendering. And now you see it. So suddenly that loading showed up. So what it's doing is kind of interesting. It's still one request to the server. The server is returning kind of skeleton HTML, including the loading indicator. And then the async process continues. And in the same response stream, when it's finished, it streams the rest of the data back. And in the browser, Blazor will essentially render the first part. And when that extra data comes, it will kind of patch it in, you know, intelligently. So it won't overwrite the DOM, it doesn't need to. It will do an intelligent diff to bring the new data into the DOM. And you can see that potentially in here. When you do a search, you can see here that this response now, the crucial thing here is that the initial wait was hardly anything, just a few milliseconds, and then the rest of the content downloaded. So that's why we saw that kind of initial loading very quickly within milliseconds, and then the rest of the content downloaded. Okay, cool. So that's streaming rendering, which is just a kind of, so I think it uses layers. So we've added in static server-side rendering. That's like the base layer. We've added in streaming rendering, which is another tool that we have that we can just use for things like this. And then we're going to look at some of the others as well. So that's that one. We've just covered, I think, the next one on here, which is streaming rendering. So let's take it up to like another feature now. So say we want to be able to like a character. So this is, you search for some characters, you get a list of results, you want to like one, which we've all been trained to do so well by Facebook and Twitter now. It's instinctive. It's a missing feature if that doesn't exist. So the question is, well, how do we do this? And can we do it with what we've seen so far? So could we do it with static rendering and forms? And we probably could, but it would be a bit of a problem. And I'll try and explain why. So you could imagine that with all your search results, you wrap a form around every one. You put a like button there. When you hit the like button, it kind of posts maybe the ID of the one that you're liking, and it goes to the server and it does whatever it's going to do. And that would work. The problem is it's a little bit limited, because if you think about how this is working, we're making the request, routing to a Razor component, rendering something, returning HTML. And in our case, we're hitting the Marvel API, but we could also be hitting a database or something at that point. The problem with everything I've just described is that because this is static, that server is kind of done. Sorry, that component is done. So we make the request, we render it, we hit Marvel, render it, return the HTML, and that component is kind of killed off, dead, doesn't exist anymore. So it has no state. So if you think our search results, we fetched all the search results, rendered it, returned it. When you hit the like button in this scenario, it would do the whole thing again. And you just end up fetching 20 results again just to do one like. So it's naturally a bit inefficient for this kind of interactivity. So this is a good example of where Microsoft are giving us more tools, and with that comes more power and more decisions that we have to make about what we're using when. So my kind of feeling is to start with static, but then as soon as you need some kind of interactivity, and I would class this as interactivity, that's probably a good case for using Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly. So the question is, well, how can we do that? So let's look at the first of those and the easiest, which is interactive server. Okay, so we're going to implement our like button here. And what we're essentially saying is that we want to take this markup, and what we're trying to do is kind of put something in here. So put an extra element in here to like a specific search result. But the first thing I would always do in this scenario is say, does this need to be refactored? So is it already saying to me, oh, maybe we should refactor this? And there's quite a good argument here that we could. So it's not terrible, like there's not too much markup here, but there is a bit, and it's beginning to take on maybe one or two responsibilities, especially when we add the like button. So my instinct is to refactor to make the change easier. So in this case, I'd be tempted to see if I can just extract this to a component to make the next step a little bit easier. So we can look at that, see how that would work. If you think about what we're doing here, we're looping over results and then we're rendering a card for each. So what we could do is essentially take all of this markup and create a new Blazor component, and we could call it something like search result. And we can paste in the markup that we just had, and immediately everything is broken. Okay, so this is refactoring. Although some people might tell you refactoring shouldn't break everything. I don't know. Sometimes you have to. Got to, what's the word? Phrase, break eggs to make an omelette. That's kind of, that's what we're doing. So sheds are now omelets. I can, any more metaphors I think of, I'll throw them at. Yeah. So what we've done is we've broken this because it doesn't know what a result is at this point. So what we can do is bring that in as a parameter. So we can say, I want to be able to provide whatever this is, and it's a character, I'm going to say. That's from the Marvel API itself, and now that's called results. We can go in here and we can just fix our compile errors. I mean, that's a good thing. I think generally refactoring to components is a case of moving code and then fixing the compile errors. That's kind of the process. But that's worked. So nothing's broken at this point. And what we can do is jump back to here and say, oh, that's cool. What happens then if I cut this out and I say search results instead? and I pass it the character results, that's what we called it. Pass it the result, which is this one here. Let's try that, see if that works. Okay, so hopefully that refactor's worked and it's not lying to us. Now, to me, that's a good step because it's like, well, actually, I've got this kind of dedicated card component now that I can work with, I can add logic to, and this markup is easier to understand. So that, I see that as a successful refactor, but I do tend to think of refactors as an experiment. So move some code, see if it breaks, fix the compile errors. If it doesn't work, just kind of revert, just go back a step and try a different refactor. It's kind of that process for me. But in that case, I would say that's worked quite nicely. So if we jump again, and the thing is, if I don't remember what's in these commits, this is a bit like I could do the wrong commit here or have code that I'm not expecting on the screen. So hopefully this isn't the evolution of what we just saw.
You haven't memorized all of them.
I haven't, well, not all of them, no. Okay, this is good. So all I've done here, that's the same thing that we just did, hopefully. Yeah, moved everything over. So yeah, nothing different there. All I've done here, though, is implement the like. So I'll just show you what that is. It's one tiny bit of code, really, here. Like this. And the main thing in there is actually this button. So what we've got is a button, which when we click it, it is going to call this like handler, which we'll look at in a minute, and it's an image. Now, if I take this off a second so that we don't jump the gun.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
And apologies if you explained this while I was already in pizza. Stop propagation. Are you going to
Okay.
explain what that is?
No, I am going to explain it. And no, I didn't explain it already.
I get it. Yeah, just repeat the question. So
Yes,
someone
absolutely. So Pete's question here, which I just said I wasn't going to answer, is what stop propagation is doing here. So it's not actually necessary yet, but it's something on another version of this I ended up putting in. Essentially, if we were to wrap this card in a button so that the whole card becomes clickable, which you might want to do because you want to go to a details page. So you want the whole card click details page. You get this horrible thing in HTML where the outer button kind of takes priority. So then if you have an inner button, like the like button in this case, you can try and click it as much as you like, but the outer button, it takes precedent. So you can't click it, stills it. So essentially this is what stop propagation does, is it fixes that problem. I discovered that yesterday. So that was new to me.
I'm not seeing that one.
Yeah, I discovered it yesterday and thought people asked me to explain it. So yeah, but no, it's really useful, really, really handy. It's like there's so many things in programming that you don't know. And if you just knew that one line of code, it would solve the very problem. And then you use ChatGPT and it gives you some made up answer about something else. And then you get around the houses and eventually you come to this. So that's what we did. No worries. So so this like button here, rendering this statically, the way we are to this point, I can click this as often as I like. And this code here, which I was hoping would say liked or unliked, is going to do absolutely nothing. And in a way, this shows you the limitation of static server-side rendering. So I've got a button, I've wired it up to this like method, and I've got a like method that does something, but because it's static, like we just described, it sits on the server, it gets returned HTML in the browser, disconnected, it's dead, there's no interactivity, basically. Which is why we need the render modes, which are server and WebAssembly, to fix that problem. So if I put back what I just removed, this one component now, and obviously it's in a loop, so it's actually several instances of that component, but this one search result component will now run interactively, which should mean now when I click that, and forgive my horrible UX here with the terrible button, but you see it's working. And why is that working? Well, if we look in the browser tools, and look at the console specifically, so I'll just make this a bit bigger, go to the console. You can see that when I hit this page now, it opened up a Blazor server socket connection. So that's Blazor server springing into life, which until now we haven't used. So nothing that I'd done in this project until now needed Blazor server or Blazor WebAssembly. So no socket connections, no WebAssembly, it's all running on the server. But now I've kind of introduce this bit that does need Blazor server, and that opens that connection. But what's quite good is it will, in .NET 8 now, it will drop that connection when you stop using it. So if I go to a page that doesn't use that connection, you'll see here that the connection was disconnected, which is much neater. So hopefully your server resources are going to like have a party at this point, because before that connection would pretty much stay open the whole time, and now it will intelligently just drop it. And the logic is, if there's no components on the page using Blazor server, it will ditch the connection. Obviously, that introduces other challenges or questions, which is, well, if you're trying to use app state at a high level for your whole app, you've got to be aware that that's a bit trickier now, because if you're disconnected, then you try and reconnect, you're not going to be reconnected to your old app state. So there's, as ever, more tools, more decisions, nuances to consider. But in terms of what we've just seen, as Pete used the exact phrase earlier that I've been using, which is islands of interactivity. So you can go to a page and you get this kind of part of the page is now running interactively, but the rest of it isn't. So the rest of the links and everything here are just running, statically still. And something else while we're here that's worth kind of knowing, by default, .NET 8 is going to enhance the navigation, which sounds a very kind of funny way of saying what it, given what it is. But essentially, when you go to a page, if you imagine you go to that home page, if this was just a normal website, what would happen there is what happens when you first go to a page. So when you first go to a page, it loads the document, and then it essentially loads all this other stuff, CSS, everything. And without the enhanced navigation, that would happen every time you navigated around. So you click on another page, it would load all the CSS, all the style sheets, all the images, everything from scratch, the whole document. And enhanced navigation uses the fetch API instead. And what that looks like is that when you go to a different page, it does a fetch request, which means it doesn't refetch all the style sheets and everything. And it gets for some reason, Edge just won't show me this HTML. I don't know why, but trust me, there is HTML being returned from the fetch, which again, Blazor patches into the DOM intelligently. So it gives you this kind of smooth experience as you navigate around, because you're not reloading the entire page every single time. So so that's kind of Blazor Server Interactive and why you might use it. And one thing I just wanted to call out while we're talking about enhanced navigation, it's not enabled by default for forms, because it could cause a problem. Because what will happen is you submit a form and it would essentially try and use enhanced navigation, but that only works for Razor components. So if you submitted a form that was going somewhere else, it would try that using enhanced, using the fetch API, it would fail, so it would try it again. But they took the decision that it wasn't that safe to let people's forms be posted twice, because it could cause all sorts of, double submission of data and stuff like that. So you have to opt into it, but you can do that. So going back to our form here, and I have actually done it here in this commit, data enhance. So what will now happen is that will use the fetch API. And the difference is that when you run this with the DevTools open, same kind of thing, you see it uses the fetch. It loads the images, that's why you're seeing lots of stuff in here. But in terms of what it loaded otherwise, it was just this fetch request. But if you take that off, just to close that loop, so you've seen it both ways. If we take that off, I think that's probably loaded, and then do that again, you'll see it's a full document request, because it did a full form post that time. So that's like we're rattling through .NET 8 here. But I would say that they're the real key things: static server-side rendering, the streaming rendering, which is a nice little enhancement. When you need interactivity, by far the easiest way to do that is server, because you don't really have to change anything. You saw what we did there. It was one line, suddenly it's running interactively and it all works. But let's just talk about the last couple of things here. So we've done that one. And what's actually happening, just to kind of call this out, is this small part of the UI is running the Blazor server, and it just opens up this socket connection in the background. So now what's happening is that when you click on that button, just as Blazor servers always works, it sends a little message over a socket connection. Blazor routes that on the server to the Razor component, returns the kind of new UI, and it just sends a little DOM diff back up to the browser, which kind of patches the DOM with the changes. But the key is it's all doing over that socket connection. So that's interactive server and our ability to use it in .NET 8. One thing we did there, I just wanted to kind of talk about very briefly, was refactoring. So it's always a question, when do you refactor? In general, I would say more than we do. So I think I feel like refactoring is the biggest skill that's probably underrated in web development, which a lot of us, myself included, don't always practice and develop, which makes a huge difference. I just think the ability to go to code and say, how do I not how do I come in here and shoehorn in the pattern that I always use, which is the temptation, but how do I come in here and look at this and look at what it's telling me and figure out a small change to try and see if that improves things. That kind of refactoring. Not necessarily an easy skill, but I think a really valuable skill. And in Blazor, it's the same thing it is as, C#, big classes, big components. So if you get a big component, and again, it's so subjective, but it could be, 20 lines, Pete might decide that's too big. 2,000 lines, you might decide that's too big. I think that the thing is just look at it. Is there a lot of HTML? Is there a lot of markup? More importantly, perhaps, is there a lot of code in here, conditional logic, that kind of thing? Business logic is the real clue, which kind of leads into this one too. Is it doing more than one thing? Again, one thing is, again, a subjective thing, but I do, like we just saw with the like button, if we'd have tried to do that all in the top level component, we've suddenly got fetch results, show results, handle the like button. I'm beginning to think, that's a couple of things I think there, the like button especially, because that's likely to evolve over time and, the kind of same thing. And this one, there's a real red flag warning here, which is that don't repeat yourself causes a lot more problems than it solves sometimes. So we need to be careful with this one. Code repeated elsewhere, I think the important thing is that it is the same thing. So the temptation is to see some markup over here and some markup over there, and so they look kind of similar. So we're going to put them together, and then you put them together. And if you do that too much, you suddenly have 20 places in your code all pointed to this one component. And the real clue is if that component starts having loads of conditional logic, because suddenly it's like, well, hang on, this is handling 25 use cases. So were they the same, or are they actually, different things? So there's ways to spot that, but I would say the don't repeat yourself thing is something to really just kind of park and look at it more as, is this a thing that I, in my project that I'm actually going to use more than once, which is actually unique in a way. So a good example is a card. I haven't done it in this case, but that search result that looks a bit like a card. There's a good argument to say if we needed to use that same kind of rough UI, the card kind of bootstrap card elsewhere, I'd be quite happy to create a card component and have the search result use it because, that makes sense. But of course, you just have to watch it because if you have, like, say, 100 places in your code using one thing, and then you start extending it with conditional logic, that's the clue to me that maybe it's now doing too much and it might be the wrong abstraction. So there's probably a whole talk on refactoring, Blazor there to look at. And it brings us to probably the last kind of thing I wanted to just show in terms of .NET 8, which is in many ways the hardest one to do, I think. So interactive WebAssembly, let's kind of look at what it is. And then I'll explain why I think it's a bit tricky. So out of interest, the people who are using Blazor, hands up if you are using Blazor WebAssembly. Okay, cool. So that's good to know. So for those who don't know, WebAssembly is where it runs in the browser. So it literally downloads part of your app or your whole app to the browser and runs the whole thing in the browser. And in the .NET 8 project template, we actually have a handy component for demoing this, which is this counter. And this is actually using a new thing called auto mode, which will use server initially and then switch to Blazor WebAssembly. So I think by now it's probably switched. And what that means is I'm clicking on this and this is actually being handled in the browser. So the whole, like I say, the whole app or this page anyway was loaded into the browser and all the interactions are local. So I'm clicking on this, it's being handled in the browser. No socket connection, so we're not worried about that. The auto mode is interesting in .NET 8, and this is the new thing, because if I clear this storage, and sometimes it's hard to make this actually show up, but let's give it a go. If I refresh this page, you'll notice it opens a socket connection first. So actually, this is currently running using Blazor server, and it will do now until I refresh this page. But you notice it also loaded Blazor WebAssembly kind of in the background. So it started with Blazor server. It loaded Blazor WebAssembly, but it won't auto switch. And the reason it won't auto switch is because I don't think they would know, Microsoft really would have a good way of transferring the state. So if you imagine you have a load of components load Blazor server, and then WebAssembly fires in and tries to take over, you've got to somehow take all the state from the server and pass it over to the client. I think it's just probably not a good idea. But what will happen is when I refresh this page, it will use Blazor WebAssembly straight away. So you notice it's not bothered with the socket connection this time. So that's the new part in .NET 8. But otherwise, the WebAssembly interactive mode is like the server one. You can enable it for specific components. So technically, we could try and run our component over here that we've been working on in WebAssembly mode. It's just architecturally a little bit harder. We can't just switch it on, because what you have to do is deploy that component to the browser. And if you think about it, it would be problematic to take your whole server-side application and say, here you go, just ship that to the browser and let it run in the browser. Because if you're trying to connect to databases and, you might have secrets in there like config stuff that really shouldn't end up in the browser. So that's not really going to work. So what they do instead is, the way it works is that you have a separate client project. So that counter component actually lives in the client project. And when we run the app and we say that component should run in Blazor WebAssembly mode, or in this case, auto, which is what we just saw, for that to work, it basically has to live in this client project. And this whole client project is then sent over to the browser, basically, and downloaded as DLLs under the hood to the browser and runs in the browser. But you can imagine that just architecturally is a bit harder. So it's dead easy to take an app that's running on the server and say, run it over Blazor server, because everything kind of just works. The minute you say it's got to run in Blazor WebAssembly, you can't just call databases directly and that kind of thing. So you're going to have to put a web API in between them. And then you would have to have this component called the web API, which would call the database. So architecturally, they're just different things, which to me says if you're thinking of using WebAssembly, you need to have that in mind quite early on, because you've got to build things like the web API and all that kind of stuff. But technically, and in practice, it's possible, as we've seen, to build Blazor components now, Razor components, and run them statically, run them with streaming rendering, run them interactively on the server, and run them interactively in the browser. And Microsoft has given us a lot of tools. It remains to be seen whether we shoot our own foot by mistake with them when we try and use them. Plus, there's always that question of new tools. How do you use them? How do you decide? Do you try and use the wrong one for the wrong job and that kind of thing? But I think it's an interesting time for a Blazor developer or someone interested in it, because static server-side rendering means this suddenly becomes a drop-in replacement for something like Razor Pages. You can see the way, if you've used Razor Pages, how similar it was at the beginning with forms and static rendering. And then it gives you this kind of extra thing now that you can enable interactivity, as we've seen there today. And this is just quickly showing you what the WebAssembly mode looks like. I'll just rattle through this because it's kind of near the end, but you can just see here, visit a page, makes a request to the server, sends an app back, so the client app to the browser, and then the router is running on the browser. So what will then happen is it will forward the request /search to the components running in the browser and find the relevant one and render it that way. So that's the kind of under the hood way that works. Just one thing I wanted to just show really quick, and it's kind of tangential, but I think it's always important to know these things, is deployment. So a .NET web app now it's interesting. We've always been very tied to Windows hosting with .NET, like historically, and paying for Windows licenses and expensive Windows hosting. And obviously, When it went cross-platform, that changed. So we have the ability to run on Linux. And it kind of shifted again. So cloud came along, and then also Docker came along and said, hey, you can package up your app and run it virtually anywhere. And Docker has always been one of those things that you have to learn, and then it's a Docker file, and then it makes no sense, and then you learn enough to know how to make it work, and then it breaks, and you realize you don't know enough. So you have to spend hours. I was going to say searching. I think now we just say chat GPT probably, but it's a whole thing to learn. I didn't know this existed till a few weeks ago, but it turns out that a couple of versions ago, or at least .NET 7, Microsoft introduced a publish profile, default container, which will generate a Docker file, a Docker image for you without having to have a Docker file. So it'll take your .NET project and create a Docker image. The bit before the container registry repository, so just that top bit, the publish profile, if you run that on the machine and you've got Docker installed, it will literally do that, generate a Docker image. If you add these two parameters, this is pointing to my Docker Hub registry and my /Marvel test. If I run that, it will actually do the whole thing remotely on Docker Hub and push the image up there. And I think in that scenario, you don't even need Docker installed locally. It will do the whole thing remotely and ping it over to Docker Hub. But I wanted to show it because I think this opens up a lot of doors for hosting. I use this now with DigitalOcean to host on there. Fly.io is an interesting host. There's a new one I used the other day called, I think it's called Render, that you can just point it at a Docker image and it'll just deploy it out and scale up and all that stuff. So I wanted to kind of drop this in there as the big tangent at the end, but just because it's interesting, I think, how do you take your .NET app, Blazor or otherwise, and deploy? And I think these tools in .NET 8 are being refined, and it's a good one to know about. Otherwise, I think I am done. So thank you very much. Immediate questions before food?
There is one online.
Okay, cool.
Dave, why would you use WebAssembly instead of the other approaches? Other approaches seem quite heavyweight and complex for regular applications.
Yes, perfect. And I think that's the thing. So I think one of the challenges of Blazor from the get-go has been that almost the first thing you had to decide was, do you use, which of the hosting models do you use? That's the first thing you decide. The second thing you decide if you're going to use them is which of the component libraries to use. So they're like the two big decisions I see people wrestling with. But on the hosting models, my feeling with .NET 8 is that I would start with static because that's the obvious place to start now. I would probably try and use Blazor Server for interactivity. The only caveat there is you've still got things like when that socket does lose its connection, you get a fairly ugly error message pop up. And in some cases, that's a problem. So I knew someone who was using like a bit of software on a tablet, basically, and people were filling in medical information. And I said, the problem with Blazor Server is you're filling in information, you put the tablet down, you come back and it says server has disconnected. And no one's really found a great solution to that problem. Interestingly, .NET 8 static might help there. If you think of the app we've got here, if it's not all running Blazor Server, you're reducing the chances of running into that error because a lot of it is static. To answer the question about WebAssembly, it's very good for disconnected or semi-disconnected scenarios. So if you're running an app that doesn't want to make too many requests to a network, you can do that with WebAssembly and run it almost offline because it's all running on the client. And if you enable progressive web apps, PWAs, you can literally have the app running on the machine with no connectivity, and that would work. I don't think you can do that without Blazor WebAssembly, so it would make sense there. But my gut feeling is that we tend as developers to take the easiest path, and WebAssembly isn't necessarily the easiest path now. So it'll be interesting to see how people find themselves, whether they still stick with it or whether they try and do a different approach, and we'll see. But I think there are probably niche use cases or specifics where it makes sense. And then, as I say, a lot of people will probably start with server and see where it takes them.
There is one more as well.
Yeah.
From Stefan, it's kind of two questions, I think.
Sure.
Can I make the parameter and supply parameter from query attributes required using the required keyword in C#?
You can. There is a required there was a required attribute that you can use with
Yeah.
parameters now, which I think will catch at compile time if you have, but it's interesting how that would work, because I'm not sure that makes sense for supply parameter from query. So I don't know is the answer. You can, one thing to just point out there, we used a string. So we had a string parameter and we said supply parameter from query. I'm pretty sure that's the only way you could do that with a query string. But what we didn't look at today is you can also do a form post, and you can use a new thing called supply parameter from form. And that uses model binding. And that model binding can model bind to complex objects. So you can have a model class, and you can have a form that's bound to that class. And when you post the form, it will essentially take all the posted form values and model bind them to the class, to the instance of the class. So I don't know the exact answer to that question, whether you can just make it market required and how that would work, whether that would fail or what that would look like. My answer to those things when I don't know them is always to think I would probably just do a quick experiment and just try it, and see. But yeah.
I guess to follow up from that, can you mark them as init only and set them in manually in tests? That's the whole question.
Unit testing.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would check out BUnit. So BUnit is well worth looking at for testing your components, I would say. Let's just look at this. I think you can set them in this, but this is exactly the kind of thing where, like I say, I'll do a quick experiment so we can quickly see whether this works. Well, as quick as it can build, if it will build. That might be telling us that it can't. Or that could be, yes. Okay, so that's pretty clear that you can't. So it would have to be set. That error there is all about the fact that I used a NET there, I believe. So yeah.
Thank you.
Cool, no worries. Any follow-up questions or yeah?
Is there a good upgrade path for this from .NET 6? Or is it the typical stuff of like a new project?
Okay, so the question for Zoom is there an upgrade path from an earlier version of .NET? I'm not deliberately plugging my blog now, I promise. But I did think about this. So I wrote an article about how to do it, to migrate specifically from Blazor server. People keep asking me to do one for Blazor WebAssembly, so I think I'm going to have to, which means I've got to work it out. But there is. So I'm just to quickly go through this. It's actually not too bad because essentially what you can do, I won't go through this really, it's a bit boring, but essentially what you can do is take your app.razor, your app. Whatever it is, host.cshtml, whatever that file is, and essentially migrate it to this. And that seems to work fairly well, I find. So I've done this a few times, taken a Blazor server project and migrated it, and it seemed to work quite well. There's a few caveats to watch out for. Something we didn't talk about here, by the way, is that it defaults to pre-rendering. So if you've ever looked at pre-rendering, you know what that is. It's one of those weirdly, sometimes hard to get your head around subjects. But what that means is when you hit a page, like our search results page, it actually rendered the search results card thing twice. So it did it once on the server, which is where the pre-rendering comes in. So it has some HTML to send back to the clients. And then it kind of clicks in with Blazor server, so it renders it again. And the whole idea of that is that your first request is fast to get something on the screen, and then the interactivity kicks in. But anyway, it's just worth mentioning because if you need or don't need pre-rendering, that factors in here as well. But no, I would say there is my caveat here is I've taken a very simple app and migrated it successfully. I would hate to say, yeah, your big app that's been around for 3 years is going to be dead simple to migrate. But my instinct is it's not a huge jump from what I've seen to just flip it over. And there's a way, crucially, to run your whole app using server or WebAssembly, if I can find it here. So if you look at the app.razor, if you mark the head outlet and the routes to run interactively using, for example, Blazor server, that means your whole app is Blazor server. So it's kind of as it was before, if that's what you had before, or wasn't. So that's the way to do that. Yeah, I can do the wasn't blog. People keep asking, so I'm going to have to. Yeah, exactly. But yeah. Cool. Any others? all we
If you
did.
talk about so that the hybrid thing is literally what you're talking about there, where you can patch off parts of it that are
Yes.
interactive only.
Yeah, and it's so interestingly, the React world is doing almost the same thing, is my understanding,
Yeah.
or very similar. And I think where it's complicated or it's a bit hard to understand is just because it's this idea, well, you've done everything statically and now you're introducing interactivity in places. So I think your phrase, and the one I've been using, islands, is the way to think about it, and very visually. So you look at a page, you say, well, look, draw a box on this, that's running interactively. So that bit and everything below it, crucially, is running interactively. But perhaps the whole page is rendered statically. You know, so that's kind of how I think of it. But that's the hybrid mode, essentially. Or the other kind of what you could call a hybrid mode is the auto mode we looked at, which is where you can run it in interactive mode. So it runs on server first while WASM loads in the background. And then when you reload the page, it switches to WebAssembly.
And one more question.
Sure.
And I'm definitely not the expert,
Okay.
but the last time I looked at WASM, it wasn't true WASM, so it wasn't bytecode WASM or something like that.
Yeah.
Are we there or not?
So you can do, no, you're still running, yeah,
It's a VM that you pull out.
essentially,
the DLLs and
yeah. And you can do a bit there, like you can do ahead of time compilation and stuff to try and make that a bit more, you know, performance.
Yeah.
But yes, there is some kind of layer of abstraction between you and what's running.
Yeah.
And then if you go to JavaScript, there's a whole other layer of abstraction to jump to JavaScript. But
Is that interop? I've got all the questions, but
yeah, that's good.
this is my last one. Is that interop layer the same?
It's
or
pretty
has that
much the same.
changed, or how does that work in a hybrid
It
world?
is, well, you are determined to ask me the difficult questions.
Do you want to repeat that if you're going to answer?
Yeah, so the question is around JavaScript interop and does it work the same way that it always did? Yes, for WASM and server, pretty much. There's no other way of doing it really. But interestingly, if you think about this page, app.razor, it's a Blazor component. I wish they called them Blazor components. No, it's a component. But you can put a script reference in there because it's running statically. And it used to tell you off about that. So if you try to just put some JavaScript in a component, it would say you can't do that because it didn't make sense and it was too complicated for anyone to really know what that would do. And Steve Sanderson said that. It came up in a topic. He said it just would be too complicated. No one would you can't expect a developer to really know what that's going to do in that context. But now in static mode, it makes a lot of sense because you've got a static page. So you're going to want to put JavaScript on them sometimes. And you can just put it on the page and just do it that way, which opens up all sorts of interesting possibilities. I think.
I do have one very short question.
Didn't he say last question
No.
about 4 questions ago? Did I hear that? Or was it?
Where does Maui take us?
Oh, yeah, good question.
And if it's going to take too long, we can discuss it over the pizza. It's getting cold over there.
Yeah, yeah.
Happy with that.
Yes, yeah. Where does Maui fit? So I don't know. I mean, I have no inside connection to Microsoft. You probably have one, I don't.
You can answer it without breaching some sort of an
Yeah, exactly. That's true.
That's fine.
So I watched DevReach the other day, and was it Scott Hunter? I think they were chatting to, and he was talking about Maui still being a big part of what they're doing. It's really, I don't know. I'd be speculating at this point where it sits. I think it does do a slightly different thing. I mean, you know better than me. It has different use cases. So, and obviously you can use Blazor with Maui to some extent, so they can work in tandem. How much investment Microsoft are putting into Maui, I wouldn't know. So, you know, it's like navel gazing, isn't it? But what you don't want to do in this situation is mention Silverlight, because suddenly people break out in cold sweats going. Yeah. So, yeah. Cool.
Any other questions?
In the static server pages,
Yeah.
that means our pages are now indexable by Google.
Yes.
Remember to if you can answer it, repeat it.
Oh, sorry. Yes. So the question is, are these pages, if they're rendered statically, indexable by Google? Yes, that's a big win of that. They are, as you saw in the browser, literally just pages coming back to you. And crucially, the enhanced nav, which does use JavaScript Fetch API, is only if you subsequently click on things. So if you hit a website for the first time, you'll get a full document back, and that's what a search engine would always get. So.
Does that benefit stop when you do stream rendering, was it called?
No, I think it's the same thing, because actually all that does is it's still one response back. It just kind of streams it over a bit of time as that thing takes a while to load. I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting if search engines have some kind of timer where they give up after a period of time. That would be an interesting experiment.
On that note, what happens when you go offline?
It was in my bed before
Yes.
because when I
You
put my
are
washing away,
screwed.
I moved it to
Stop
mummy's
working.
side.
Well, I think you've got to think it's like
and then
everywhere.
you put it back. You silly brain.
Well, no, you're not. Actually, you're not, because if it's in the browser and you're not interacting with it,
It's
it's
better.
fine.
Yeah.
But the minute you click on something and try and
I'm not
navigate,
listening to
that's
someone
that's
talk
actually
at the minute,
to answer
so
the previous
I'll
question
come
where
back.
WebAssembly might make more sense because you can run it all in the browser. So,
Yeah. No, I don't get scared, darling.
cool.
Even if I pop on you.
Ah,
Yeah, it's too long.
The pizza's going.
The Blazor server does the attempting to reconnect the
You read your
server,
book.
and
Come
after
on.
a while, is there
No,
a
no.
way you can stop it?
I don't think so. I think this is a bone of contention because I've spent. So it's interesting where we are now, which we would never have had like 10 years ago, I guess, is you can watch this stuff being built, which I think is really interesting. If, like me, you find the time to do it. But if you look at the GitHub issues, it's been really fascinating to watch how they've evolved this and thought about it. But the only downside is there are a lot of them. And if you try and find out things that aren't obvious, you can get lost in searching those things. But I did have a look, and as far as I could tell, there's lots of GitHub issues that talk about Blazor server, socket connections, disconnects, and trying to work it out. It seems like there's no solution to that problem coming. So if it loses a connection, you still get the ugly error that says the connection's been lost. The only thing I would say is, like I say, it changes how often you're going to see that because of the fact that you're not always using Blazor server. So I'm going to quickly go back here, but it doesn't matter. But if you think about what we saw here, you know, a lot of this isn't going to be running using Blazor server, so it's not a problem. But if you have invoked server and socket connections there, I'm pretty sure if I like stopped the project running, you'd get an error in the browser.
So where that would come. I wonder if you've got a little island of Blazor server sitting in there rather than the other way around. Pops up in
Well,
that.
I don't think it does, because I think as far as it's concerned, there's still that socket connection. There's one socket connection, no matter how many components you've got. So if it fails, I think that's the generic error that you are. That's my last time I tested it, that's what it did. Now, they have been known, Microsoft, if you can't possibly comment, but they have been known to throw things in right at the end, like the year they tried to kill Hot Reload from the terminal and caused a fuss. So you never know whether something will just sneak in at the end, but I've not really seen any evidence of that.
You can handle that error there, can't you?
There are ways of doing it.
Yeah, well,
It's a trade-off. I think everyone's going to pizza now, I'm sure, but there are trade-offs with any of these, and it's important to kind of just weigh those up always, I think. But...
Good.
Okay.
Any other questions? Was everyone hungry?
Cool.
If you mute your speakers, just so that...
yeah.
Right, so for the folks online, you don't get to enjoy the pizza. Well, you can have your own, but you can't have ours. So come back next month, of course. It'll be on online and in person, so hybrid again. So for the folks that are here, then do come back for that. And yeah, keep your eyes on Twitter. There's still time for you to win a JetBrains license or a book, courtesy of JetBrains and Calyx. So please do that. And obviously, feel free to shout about the talk. If you enjoyed it, then send a LinkedIn message or a tweet to John. I'm sure he'll enjoy that. So thanks very much to John for the talk. And thanks very much to BGSS for hosting as well. So that's a round of applause. And thanks very much to Claudius for the drink and for the food. So yeah, cheers. Look at all that. And for the folks